He was terrified of being alone, so he filled every moment with people and noise, until one day everyone disappeared, and in the silence he heard the truth he had been running from. Elias never liked silence. He filled it with voices, with music, with footsteps that were not his own. He believed that being alone meant something was wrong, that empty rooms were waiting to judge him. He learned early to invite people even when he was tired, to smile even when the smile felt borrowed. He said yes too often, because saying no meant the door would close, and behind it there would be quiet, the kind that pressed against the chest. So he ran from it. He ran into conversations that went nowhere, into laughter that faded fast, into nights that ended with phones glowing and names he barely remembered. He told himself this was connection, this was life moving, this was safety, but it was noise, gentle noise sometimes, loud noise other times, always noise, and noise kept him from hearing anything deeper. Then one evening the noise stopped, not by choice, not with warning. Messages slowed, then paused, calls were not returned, schedules changed, plans dissolved, people moved on quietly, and Elias found himself in an apartment that felt larger than it had ever been. The clock ticked louder than usual, the refrigerator hummed like a distant engine, outside a car passed and then nothing. He stood in the center of the room waiting for something to happen, waiting for someone to arrive, but the door stayed closed. Minutes stretched, then hours, and he realized no one was coming, not tonight, not to save him from himself. The thought scared him at first, his hands felt restless, his breath shallow. He checked his phone again and again, as if attention could be summoned by force, but the screen stayed calm, no new names, no small red circles, just time moving forward without asking him. He sat down slowly. The floor felt cold through his clothes, and for the first time in years he did not turn on music, he did not reach for a screen. He stayed there, surrounded by silence that was not cruel, just present. The silence did not rush him, it did not accuse him, it waited, and in that waiting something unfamiliar began to form, a thought that was not shaped by others, a feeling that did not need approval. It was faint, almost shy, but it was his, and it whispered instead of shouting, and Elias realized this was the sound he had been avoiding all along. At first Elias tried to escape the quiet. He stood up, then sat down again. He walked from one wall to another, counting steps without meaning to. His mind reached for old habits, for a voice to borrow, for a distraction to lean on, but there was nothing to grab. The silence stayed steady, like a calm surface that refused to break. He noticed small things he had ignored before, the way the light leaned across the floor, the soft sound of his own breath, the distant echo of the city that felt far away now. This kind of alone felt different, heavier but also honest. Memories began to surface without asking permission, moments where he laughed too fast, agreed too quickly, stayed longer than he wanted, all to avoid being by himself. He saw patterns clearly now, how he confused presence with connection, how he feared pauses in conversation more than lies. His chest tightened, but he did not run, he stayed. The silence held him in place. Thoughts came slowly, not in crowds but one by one. He wondered who he was when no one was watching, who he was when there was nothing to perform. The question scared him, but it also felt clean, like fresh air after a long time indoors. He realized how often he had shaped himself around others, smoothing edges, hiding doubts, becoming easy to keep around. He thought this made him safe, but now he saw how small it made him feel. The room did not react to his thoughts, it did not approve or reject them, it simply existed, and that gave him space. Real space, not the kind filled with words, but the kind where meaning could grow. He lay down on the floor, staring at the ceiling, letting the quiet stretch without resistance. Time slowed, not in a painful way, but in a gentle way, like it was giving him room to catch up with himself. He felt tired, not the kind that comes from work, but the kind that comes from pretending. His eyes closed, not to sleep, but to listen, and in the stillness he noticed something steady beneath the fear, a calm that had always been there, buried under noise, waiting patiently. And for the first time Elias understood that being alone was not the same as being abandoned. It was simply being present with no audience, and that idea stayed with him, soft but firm, as the night continued to unfold. The room learned his breathing before he did, slow then uneven. The walls listened without judging. Elias sat on the floor because the chair felt too familiar, like an old role waiting for him to sit properly. He wanted something neutral, something that did not expect him to be anything. His thoughts moved differently now, not racing, not colliding, just drifting in and out. He noticed how often his mind tried to create an audience, how even alone he imagined reactions, imagined explanations, imagined being understood. He caught himself doing it and let it pass. The silence did not reward him for letting go, it simply remained, steady and patient. Memories appeared again, not sharp, more like shadows, faces without clear edges, voices without exact words. He remembered moments when he felt invisible even in a room full of people, moments when laughter filled the air but never reached him. He had blamed himself for those feelings, told himself he needed to be better, louder, easier. But now sitting there alone he wondered if the problem was never his volume, maybe it was his absence from himself. The idea felt strange, but it settled quietly. He placed a hand on his chest, feeling the rhythm there, real and constant. No one else could hear it, yet it kept going, faithful without witnesses. He thought about how much energy he spent being seen, and how little he spent actually noticing. The silence offered no answers, but it gave him time, and time felt generous, he realized. He did not need to solve anything tonight, he did not need a conclusion. The night was not asking for progress, only honesty, and honesty felt easier without eyes on him. He stayed like that for a long while, not counting minutes, not waiting for a signal, just existing in a way that felt new and old at the same time, and somewhere in that quiet he felt a small shift, not happiness, not relief, but permission to be unfinished, permission to be quiet, permission to be alone without fear, and that permission felt like the beginning of something he could not yet name. The night moved forward without drama, the window darkened fully, the city sounds softened into distant pulses. Elias noticed how the silence changed shape. It was no longer empty, it felt layered, like a space where thoughts could arrive and leave without pushing each other. He stood up slowly and walked to the window, not to look for someone, just to look. Lights were on in other apartments, lives continuing without him, and for the first time that did not feel like rejection, it felt neutral. Almost peaceful. He realized how often he had measured his worth by proximity, by being included, by being needed. Now there was no measurement, and that absence felt strange but freeing. He rested his forehead against the cool glass, feeling grounded, present. His reflection looked unfamiliar, not because it had changed, but because he was actually seeing it without commentary, without comparison, just a person standing alone in a room, breathing, existing. He turned away and sat back down. The floor welcomed him again. His thoughts slowed further, they no longer rushed to fill gaps, they seemed comfortable with space between them. He thought about the future, not in plans, but in feelings, how he wanted it to feel quieter inside, more honest, less crowded. He understood now that his fear of being alone had been a fear of listening, because listening meant hearing doubts, regrets, desires he had buried under activity, but those things were not attacking him, they were simply waiting for acknowledgement. The silence made room for them without forcing anything. He felt a sense of trust forming, not in others, not in outcomes, but in his own ability to sit with himself. The clock continued its steady rhythm, marking time without urgency. Elias closed his eyes again, not to escape, but to stay, and in that stillness he realized something simple and important. Loneliness was not created by being alone, it was created by leaving yourself behind, and tonight he had finally stayed. The thought did not demand action, it just settled gently, like a truth that did not need to be proven, and with that understanding the silence felt less like an enemy and more like a companion that knew how to keep a secret. Morning arrived quietly, not with alarm or urgency, but with light slipping into the room. Elias noticed it before he opened his eyes, a soft warmth on his face. The silence of night had changed but it had not left, it felt lighter now, like a calm presence that followed him into waking. He sat up slowly, his body stiff from the floor, but his mind felt clear in a way he was not used to. There was no rush to check messages, no impulse to see who existed outside this room. He stayed still, listening to his own movement, the sound of breath, the small shift of weight, simple things that felt strangely important. He stood and walked to the kitchen. The familiar space felt different, not smaller, just quieter. He poured water into a glass and watched it fill, noticing how present he felt in that small action. Thoughts came again, but they were not heavy. They asked gentle questions. What do I actually need today? What do I want when no one is asking? The answers did not come clearly, but that felt fine. Uncertainty no longer felt like danger, it felt like space. He remembered how mornings used to begin with noise, with updates, with comparisons, with borrowed urgency. Now there was none of that, and he realized nothing was missing. He looked at his phone finally, not with hope or fear, just curiosity. Notifications were few, and they did not pull at him. He set the phone down without responding. Surprised at how natural it felt, he returned to the center of the room, standing where he had waited the night before. But the waiting was gone. He was not expecting anything to arrive, he was already here, fully. The silence remained, not as emptiness, but as room to move, to think, to choose. Elias understood that this was not a moment that would last forever. The world would return, voices would come back, but something had shifted underneath it all, a quiet strength, a knowing that he could be alone without disappearing. And as the morning continued to unfold, he carried that knowing with him, steady and unseen, like a breath he no longer had to force. As the day moved on, Elias stepped outside, not to meet anyone, just to walk. The street was familiar yet distant, sounds passed by him without pulling him in, conversations floated and faded, cars moved then disappeared. He noticed how little of it demanded his reaction. His steps found a rhythm that felt natural, not rushed, not slow, just enough. He remembered how walking used to feel like moving between destinations, always towards something else. Now it felt like being exactly where he was, each step complete on its own. He passed faces without attaching stories to them, without wondering what they thought of him. This freedom felt subtle but deep. he realized how much energy he had spent being seen, how exhausting it had been to exist as an idea in other minds. Now he existed as a body moving through space, breathing, sensing. The sun touched his skin briefly before clouds passed, even that felt meaningful. Simple contact with the present. His thoughts returned to the fear that once guided him, the fear of being forgotten, left behind, unseen. Walking alone, he understood something gently. Being unseen did not mean being unreal. His existence did not depend on witnesses. This idea did not arrive loudly. It arrived like a realization that had been waiting for him to slow down. He stopped at a crosswalk and waited for the light, standing still among others, yet separate. And he did not feel smaller for it, he felt whole. When the light changed, he crossed without hurry, trusting his pace, trusting the quiet inside him. The city continued around him, indifferent and alive, and for the first time he felt comfortable being just another presence within it, not competing, not performing, simply passing through with awareness. The silence followed him, not as absence, but as an inner steadiness that made the world feel less overwhelming, and Elias knew this was not an escape from life, it was a way of finally entering it without losing himself along the way. Later that day Elias returned home, the door closing behind him with a soft sound. The apartment welcomed him without expectation. He noticed how different it felt to come back by choice, not because there was nowhere else to be, but because he wanted the quiet again. He placed his keys down carefully, listening to the small metallic echo. Each sound felt deliberate, as if the space responded when he paid attention. He sat at the table and did nothing for a while, not out of boredom, but out of respect for the stillness he had found. Thoughts appeared again, but they were clearer now, shaped by honesty rather than fear. He considered his relationships, not with judgment, but with curiosity. Which connections felt real, which ones existed only to keep silence away? The answers did not accuse him, they simply showed themselves. Some names felt warm, others felt heavy, and he understood the difference mattered. He realized he did not need many voices, he needed a few true ones, and most importantly his own. The silence allowed him to hear that voice without distortion. It spoke calmly, without urgency. It did not demand change all at once. It asked for awareness, for patience, for boundaries that protected his energy. He thought about how often he had filled his time to avoid feeling, and how empty that fullness had been. Now even an empty afternoon felt rich, full of presence, full of space to breathe. He stood and opened a window slightly, letting fresh air move through the room. It carried distant sounds, but they did not disturb the quiet inside him. They blended with it. He understood then that silence was not something fragile. It could exist alongside the world. It did not need isolation to survive. This realization felt important, grounding. Elias smiled softly, not because he was happy in a loud way, but because he felt aligned, and that alignment felt like something he could return to, again and again, no matter who was or was not around him. That evening Elias sat with a notebook in front of him, the pages blank and open. He did not rush to fill them. He let the silence sit between him and the paper, waiting for something honest to arrive. He realized how often he had written for others, shaping words to be liked, to be understood. Now there was no audience, only him. The pen felt heavier in his hand, not with pressure, but with intention. He wrote slowly, not sentences at first, just fragments, feelings without structure, thoughts without polish. The words did not need to make sense to anyone else, and that freedom made them real. He paused often, listening, letting the quiet guide the pace. Outside the sky darkened again, but it did not carry the same weight as the night before. It felt familiar now, almost friendly. He read what he had written without judgment, noticing how different it sounded from his usual voice, calmer, more direct, less apologetic. He understood then how much of his life had been a translation, turning himself into something easier for others to read. Here there was no translation needed, only truth. The silence held that truth without reacting, without trying to improve it, and that acceptance felt rare and powerful. He closed the notebook gently, not because he was finished, but because it was enough for now. He knew he could return to it, just as he could return to this state of being. He did not need to chase expression. It would come when he was present. He leaned back in his chair and looked around the room, noticing how grounded he felt within it. The apartment no longer felt like a waiting space. It felt like a place where he belonged, not because it was filled with people, but because he was fully there. And that sense of belonging felt deeper than anything he had searched for outside himself. Night settled again, but this time Elias did not brace himself against it. He moved through the evening calmly, making simple food, cleaning without rushing. Each action felt complete on its own. The quiet no longer asked to be filled, it simply existed alongside him. He noticed how his mind no longer reached outward by default, it rested more easily within the present moment. Thoughts came and went without clinging. He remembered how nights used to feel heavy with waiting for messages, waiting for proof that he mattered. Now there was no waiting, only time passing gently, and that felt enough. He sat on the couch and allowed himself to feel everything that remained, small traces of sadness, moments of regret, memories of times he had abandoned his own needs to avoid being alone. These feelings surfaced softly, without sharp edges, and he welcomed them, understanding that avoiding them had only given them power. The silence did not erase pain, but it made room for it to be acknowledged, and in that acknowledgement something loosened. He placed a hand over his heart again, feeling that steady rhythm, unchanged by his fears or hopes. He realized this rhythm had always been there, even in the loudest rooms, even when he felt most disconnected. It had waited for him patiently. He thought about the future again, not with anxiety, but with openness, knowing that connections would return, that people would come and go, but now there was a center within him that would remain. The idea brought a quiet confidence, not loud enough to announce itself, but strong enough to support him. As the night deepened, he turned off the lights and lay down, not to escape the world, but to rest within it. The silence wrapped around him gently, no longer something to fear, but something to trust, and Elias fell asleep knowing he was not alone, even when he was by himself. Morning came again, steady and unremarkable, and that was what made it meaningful. Elias opened his eyes and did not search for a feeling. He let the moment be what it was, neutral, alive, real. He stayed in bed for a while, listening to the quiet sounds of the building, distant movement, water in pipes, life continuing without urgency. He understood now that this quiet was not temporary. It was not tied to isolation or circumstance. It was something he carried, something he could return to. He stood and stretched slowly, feeling present in his body, grounded. The fear that once followed him like a shadow felt distant now, not gone, but understood. He knew it might return someday, but he also knew how to sit with it, how to listen instead of running. He made coffee and watched the steam rise, a small ritual that anchored him in the now. He smiled softly, not from excitement, but from recognition. This was his life, not the loud version he had chased, but the honest one he had almost missed. He realized that losing everyone for a moment had given him something rare, the chance to meet himself without interruption, and that meeting had changed the way he moved through the world. He no longer needed constant presence to feel real. He no longer feared empty rooms. He knew now that solitude was not a punishment, it was a doorway, and silence was not a void, it was a mirror. As the day unfolded, Elias stepped forward with quiet confidence, carrying his awareness with him, knowing that no matter how full his life became again, he would never abandon himself to avoid being alone, because he had learned the truth in the stillness, the one lesson the noise could never teach, that the one he feared being left with was the one he needed most. And now that they had met, he was no longer afraid of the quiet at all.